So welcome, everyone. This is episode 73 of the Bookworm, and I'm Angela Unk, Director of Development at the Clements Library. As I was just mentioning, please chime in using the chat. We enjoy having that conversation, but change the setting to everyone so that all of the participants can see. My colleague Helen will be monitoring the chat and pasting helpful information in there. If you have questions, though, please put your questions in the Q&A section. That keeps them all together. And you can also upvote questions. So if you see a question from another participant that you also want answered, you give it a thumbs up and it sends it to the top of the queue. We do, as part of our Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion program, have the live machine captions turned on today. So go ahead and toggle those on or off, and you can also change the size of the text. And side-by-side mode should be enabled so that you can see the slides next to the speaker and change the relative size of the portions. So please play around with your screens a little bit so that they look good to you. This program is brought to you by the William L. Clements Library, located on the campus of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor. And the Clements Library's mission is to collect, preserve, share, and promote the study and discussion of primary sources related to all aspects of the history and culture of North America and the Caribbean up to about 1900. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge that the University of Michigan is located on the territory of the Anishinaabe people. In 1817, the Ojibwa, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations made the largest single land donation to the University of Michigan, offered ceremonially as a gift in the text of the Treaty of the Foot of the Rapids, so that their children could be educated in a Western manner. We acknowledge the history of Native displacement that allowed the University of Michigan to be founded. Today, we reaffirm contemporary and ancestral Anishinaabe ties to this land and their profound contributions to this institution. The William L. Clements Library also acknowledges that it has and continues to benefit from the original land dispossession and established hierarchies of settler colonialism. All right, everybody, if you haven't yet taken the poll question, you have a moment to click before I share the results. All right, so we asked how many trunks housed British General Thomas Gage's papers during his time in the American colonies. And these are the trunks that came to the Clements Library with the papers. And 50% of you knew that the answer is 12. And I am not at all surprised that 34% of you selected 20 because 12 just seems like too few. So thank you for for taking the poll, and you'll hear more about this filing system from Asheesh. And today's episode has generously been sponsored by an anonymous donor who is a wonderful fan and audience member of the Bookworm. So thank you very much for doing that. And now I am delighted to introduce today's guest. Asheesh Kapur Siddique is an assistant professor in the Department of History at UMass Amherst. He is a historian of early America, early modern Europe, and the British Empire, whose research and pedagogy explore the role of collecting, managing, and using knowledge of the history of state formation and governance. Professor Siddique's first book, Archive of Empire, Knowledge, Conquest, and the Making of the Early Modern British World explores how modern data-driven government emerged out of the information order of the early modern state. And so we're excited to hear more about this and learn about your work today. So welcome.
Thank you so much, Angela. I'm just gonna share my screen. Let's see. We're going to play from start. Great. Well, I first want to just say thank you so much to Angela, to Helen, to Paul, Cheney, and all of the staff at the Clements Library for having me, and to thank you all who are here today, who've come to listen to my talk and to engage in well, what I'm sure will be a very lively conversation about archives and data and the and the past and the present of the history of information. I think it's a topic that really speaks to a lot of the questions that we are all grappling with now in an age of the internet, in an age of artificial intelligence, in the age of smartphones. And I think that the past and the history of information in the past gives us a lot to think about. And so I'm gonna kind of give some thoughts of my own that come out of the book, and then I'm really eager to hear what others think in response. And I'm going to start out actually at the Clements itself, with the trunks that we were just talking about, and asking about in the poll. I actually think there really is no better place to start this talk than in the Clements Library itself, with two remarkable objects in the collection. So in 1937, after the settlement of William Clements's library estate, the University of Michigan received several trunks which had once been in the possession of the British military officer General Thomas Gage. And in the photograph on the slide, you can see that the top box over there is an example of one of these. And the Gage trunks joined one of the foundational collections of the Clements Library, which is the papers of Sir Henry Clinton, another of the British Army's leading generals during the American Revolution, which came similarly in a set of trunks sold by his descendants at an auction in the 1920s. So General Thomas Gage's time as Commander-in-Chief of the British Army spanned a pivotal set of years in the history of the early modern British Empire. After he served from 1763, the end of the 7 Years' War that saw the British win a splendid military victory over France in North America and the West Indies, that dramatically expanded the size of their Atlantic world empire. To 1775, when Gage, then the governor of the colony of Massachusetts, received orders from London to take action against rebels at Lexington and Concord, fights that signaled the outbreak of a revolution that would change the political constitution of the British Empire, the fate of the Americas, and the future of the world. Now, given Gage's connections to these grand world-transforming events, I think it can be all too easy to forget his embeddedness in a cultural and political world and a media world that is very different and distant, and yet also, I think, very familiar to our own. But an embeddedness that his trunks can bring us back to. These trunks numbered among several that Gage's secretaries used to keep his official papers while he traipsed around North America commanding the British Army. And these were the papers through which Gage communicated with other officials, as well as his metropolitan supervisors, kept his notes, and collected information. Now, if we open up the Gage trunks, we encounter a set of pigeonholes, which you can see on the slide. And if you look a little bit more closely at the little writing on top of the pigeonholes, the labels that are there, and hopefully you can make out a few of them in the slide, and I'll also tell you what they say. You will see that Gage's secretaries labeled each of them with headings pertaining to where the papers that were stored in each of these pigeonholes came from. And so you might be able to make out in the case of this trunk, the headings of Albany, Augustine, Boston, Crown Point, Detroit, and Governors. And we can think of these trunks as a portable filing cabinet, a place for storing records that in this case was designed to accommodate the demands of mobility that the military campaign of the American Revolution demanded. General Gage's document boxes, which could be picked up and quickly moved as he and the army moved around North America, reveal a side of the 18th century and the early modern world that played a crucial, yet I think underappreciated role in the practice of politics and power in that world, that of the archive. So we think of archives today as places where those interested in history go to research the past. And this was true in the early modern world as well. People who were interested in knowing more about the past sought documents from archives in order to do the work of scholarship. And that was a very important part of the role of archives in this world. But archives, and when I mean archives, I'm talking about collections of documents and other texts about the past, were also, and in this period, even more importantly than their uses for scholarship, places that people went to work out how to govern polities, including polities like empires. And so my book, The Archive of Empire, Knowledge, Conquest, and the Making of the Early Modern British World, traces the history of how the British Empire in the 17th and 18th centuries used archives in its attempt to govern its far-flung imperial possessions, and how the growing power of the empire over non-English speaking peoples introduced significant contestation into the question of what archives were the right ones to exercise power over an increasingly diverse, polyglot, multilinguistic imperial polity. And the book argues that between the early 17th century and the early 19th century, governing institutions in the British Empire attempted to rule what came to be an empire that spanned two oceanic spheres in multiple continents by transposing a technique of making knowledge that had been central to early modern statecraft from the late 15th century onward into the project of constructing overseas rule. And that practice was the practice of correlating incoming information about the conduct of subjects and aliens in physically distant spaces with a set of normative conceptions of good governance derived from how humans had behaved in the past. Conceptions that were derived from reading and thinking about archival records. And my book traces how officials sought to produce political order through the deployment of official reason expressed in writing. And the book also explores how the demographic transformations of the British Empire in this period through conquest and trade began to complicate that work. And what I argue is that imperial expansion, and especially imperial conquest through war over populations that did not speak English and that were not, and whose cultural practices and histories were not, until that point, part of the same histories of Europe, raised the question in the minds of administrators as to whether written records in metropolitan archives contain the knowledge requisite to govern the non-English speaking populations over whom who inhabited the lands over which Britain asserted sovereignty. And I explore in the book the conflicting ways that administrators tried to answer this question, how to govern in relation to cultural difference, and the shared mode of archival reasoning in which contestation about the answers to that question occurred. So, why should these questions matter to us today? Why should we care about the early modern history of the archive? They matter, I think, because we ourselves are living in a massive transformation in the nature of information. In 2020, users of the internet generated 64.2 zettabytes of data, a quantity greater than the number of detectable stars in the cosmos. A colossal boom whose origins can be traced to the emergence of the World Wide Web in 1993. And indeed, as I write in the book, the proliferation of data and its collection, ordering, and use by modern states and companies are among the most striking features of global society today. Empowered by satellites, mobile communications, the internet, global navigation systems, and artificial intelligence, governments and corporations face the challenge of compiling, analyzing, and brokering information about human behavior that is being produced, circulated, and stored at an unprecedented and seemingly continuously accelerating scale and speed. Now, both governments and corporations use this data, take this data and use it to shape and execute projects of resource extraction, profit making, and rule. And they do so in relation to what are increasingly multi-ethnic, multilinguistic, and multi-confessional constituencies, whom they are trying to bind together despite all of their differences around a shared set of political or consumerist norms. Our times are filled with anxieties about data. Every time we connect to the internet, perform a search, answer an email, listen to music, or send a text message, we are giving away our data to companies that are using it to generate profits, and to governments that are using the data to enforce rules. And we understandably are worried when we are confronted with actually what's going on, I think, about what is being done with our data, and perhaps frustrated that we really seem to have no or very little control over how public and private actors are using it to rule and profit. We're all familiar with, going to a website and seeing that little tab pop up that says, do you consent to the privacy policies? And we sort of click yes, because that's the only way that we can actually access the website. And we don't read all the, the long fine print. And yet when we're confronted, right, as we often are these days, about news stories about how often beyond our initial knowledge, governments and social media companies are using our data in ways that seem to violate our own expectations of privacy, we are understandably very concerned. And so I think that these questions about the history of data and information are very much resonant with the ones we are the ones we are confronting right now. That isn't to say, though, just to temper expectations, that my book offers answers about what we should do about the huge problems of data governance and privacy that we confront right now, and which are such urgent social, political, and economic questions. But I do think that the history of the early modern information state and of early modern data, and of early modern information and empire, three themes that I explore centrally in the book, do matter because they remind us of a crucial truth, one that is too easily obscured by the deluge of popular narratives glorifying technological innovation. Namely, that questions about data are inherently and always about questions about politics and power, about who gets to collect, control, and use information, the ends to which information is put, and the question of what rights those who are giving up their data have over how that information, how their information is being used. I believe that we should resist any effort to insulate data governance from democratic processes, and that the only way that we can do that is if we have an informed perspective on the politics of data. And having that informed perspective, I believe, requires us not only to attend to the present, our own present moment of data and its explosion, but also to the past, to these past histories of data and data enmeshed within politics. And that is one of the key motivations and one of the key themes of the Archive of Empire. Now, our story starts long before there was the internet, or there was television, or there was cell phones, and it even starts long before the 17th century, when the British Empire began to constitute itself through war and trade in the Atlantic world and in Asia. It starts long before there was even a British Empire. And it begins with a technological revolution in communication that, though I think sometimes under-recognized, was just as consequential for the history of the West and for the history of the world as the early modern revolutions in communication technology with which we are more familiar, such as the rise of the printing press and the invention of movable type. And I'm talking about the revolution that occurred with the introduction of paper into Europe. So paper was initially invented in China, and it was made out of plants. And it came into Europe via the Arab world in the when it entered into the 8th century via long distance trade between the Arab world and East Asia. And it was transformed there under the Abbasid dynasty into a substance that was produced out of linen rags. And paper was then, paper made out of cloth or linen, was introduced into Europe by Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula in the 11th century. And paper joined, and you can see on the slide an example of what paper made out of rags looks like. So it has a very particular type of feel, and when you're looking at rag paper and you put it in your hands, you can really kind of sometimes feel the it's sort of raggy, sort of cloth-like texture. It's an amazing thing to sort of to hold in your hands. And when paper came into Europe, it joined what until then had been the major substrate of government and communication in Europe up to that point, and even beyond it, which was parchment. And so I put on the slide an example of parchment. And parchment is made out of animal hide. But paper began to slowly eclipse parchment as sort of the quotidian technology through which European commercial exchange, ecclesiastical governance, secular administration, and scholarship came to be conducted. And one of the big reasons is that linen rags, the substrate out of which paper was made, was much cheaper than animal skin to produce. Parchment continued to be used as a prestige material on which information deemed especially important, such as grants of royal or church privilege, was recorded and preserved. Now, as the British brought their parchment paper culture of government to the rest of the world through conquest, trade, war, and colonization, they mobilized these substrates as instruments of communication among a variety of powerful interests, including their officers, whom they invested with the authority to execute command at a distance, the so-called native people, into whose homelands they violently encroached and with whom they fought, exchanged, enslaved, and at times cohabitated, and their subjects, over whom they sought to assert power at a vast spatial remove and without the affordances of seemingly instantaneous technologies like email and telephones. And they did so by collecting information about how people were behaving in present time and correlating it with collections of documents in their possession about how people have behaved in the past, which they called archives. Information about how people behaved in the present could be garnered by training trusted servants in how to go and observe phenomena, sending these servants to travel in territory with instructions to write down what they saw and learned on pieces of paper, and then requiring that these disciplined travelers return the substrates on which they had written their descriptions back to the centers of power. The incoming material could then be analyzed by metropolitan officials in comparison with the authoritative records of administrative precedent in the archives, thus producing wisdom from which government decision-making could be proceed. Circulating written documents between the metropole and officials abroad, administrators sought to both direct the conduct of officers on the ground and collect geographic, demographic, diplomatic, and economic information. London administrators then analyzed the contents of these documents to ensure that what their underlings were doing on the ground comported with what they had been told to do. These London officials then filed the records within developing organizational systems as they sought to form a body of precedential knowledge under their control that could guide the work of decision-making in the present and future. And they read this information in a manner that often sought to confirm their pre-existing beliefs and conceptions of how the empire ought to work, how it ought to be governed. Less so because they were open to the possibility of changing their ideas. And officials also sought to control the flow of information to make sure that nobody but themselves had access to it. They sought to keep secrets. They sought to surveil and make sure that information remained tightly within their grasp. But in this respect, much like modern governments that are confronted with the leaks of official papers and secret records, and our times are flooded with examples of this. Think back to Daniel Ellsberg and the Pentagon Papers. Think back to WikiLeaks, etc. As today, as in the past, officials wanted to control the information, but in this respect, they often failed. As I trace in the book, during the 17th and 18th century, a political public sphere arose through which the secrets of imperial government were regularly appropriated in political discourse by critics of the empire through the constant leakage of documents beyond the official channels to which their creators intended them to be confined. And much of the book shows how the debates about the nature of empire and how it was to be conducted that emerged over the course of the late 17th and early 18th and then well into even the early 19th centuries were predicated upon this kind of constant leakage of official documents, which the opponents of empire could use to say, well, this is actually what's really going on. You guys are saying, you imperial officials are saying you're doing this, but here is actually what you are doing based on what is revealed by your own supposedly secret correspondence. Now, the experience, the archives was always a very particular type of place. It presented a very particular type of view of what the empire was, and it was a view that was inherently exclusive. It was a view that was inherently based on affirming that what political institutions and what political power was doing was right and good. And so the experiences of many of the actors who were victimized by imperial rule, including Native Americans, enslaved Africans, and their descendants, did not have any significant presence within this system of knowledge. And one of the things I do in the book is I explain why their lives do not show up in the archive in the detailed and deep ways, given their immense importance and significant role in shaping the history of the early modern British Empire. And one of my big arguments in the book is that I actually argue that the presence of non-Europeans in the British Atlantic registered quite differently from how non-Europeans were thought about and then archived in the context of British Asia. And what I argue is that from the perspective of an imperial governing and commercial elite in the Atlantic world, who understood Native Americans as outside the compass of the political subject, is effectively other sovereignties that were to be engaged through war, through trade, through diplomacy, but not subjects of the British Empire. And who were committed to the ideological fiction that enslaved Africans were property, not people. This terrible dehumanizing ideology, neither fit within the archival regime of governance, meaning that their exploitation, which is of such massive importance to the history of the early modern British Empire, never prompted reference to records in order to be justified. By contrast, in the vastly different world of imperial South Asia, where right at the same time as the British were building an empire in the Atlantic world in the 17th and 18th centuries, the crown-chartered British East India Company was building its own trading empire under the auspices of the same royal sovereign who governed over the Atlantic world. Their officials did something quite different. They sought to apply the archival mode of political reasoning to governing over Indians in India in this case. And there they endeavored to rule not simply on the basis of records from English sovereigns, but also from a variety of grants and delegations of power from South Asian governments. None more important in this period than that of the Mughal Empire, which ruled much of the region. And that resulted in the corporation's literal inhabitation of Mughal offices under the ultimate authority of the Mughal emperor. Imperial administrators in India gradually came to see the exercise of Mughal offices, the work of governing in relation to cultural difference, as incumbent on the acquisition and deployment of a different set of archives than those available in the metropole. Namely, and as I argue in the book, what they did is that they sought records of Mughal government and sought to appropriate them as part of their own imperial archive. They sought to take these records from this conquered polity and incorporate them into the archival apparatus that they then used to justify policies of rule over Indians in India. Following the emergence in the aftermath of the Glorious Revolution of 1688 of an administrative infrastructure governing an extended polity that contemporaries increasingly understood as an empire, official archival systems came to be profoundly enmeshed in political contestation and struggles over how that empire should be ruled. Officials who created imperial archives aspire to control the circulation and use of information by designing these systems to be closed, self-referential, and secret. But like their predecessors, these officials failed. Competing interest groups sought to mobilize both the rhetoric of documents and the actual material contents of archives in order to construe policy proposals related to imperial governance as authoritative, precisely because they were said to be grounded in archival evidence. And in these very contentious debates, records were used for a variety of purposes. Sometimes they were invoked after the fact as justifications for decisions and actions. Sometimes they were actually studied for their content, which then might inform somebody's future behavior. Sometimes they were not read at all, but instead simply referred to or invoked in a political debate. They could be printed as proof of a policy position, and sometimes they were simply put on display as a material manifestation of authority. Now, these modes of using records were different from one another, but I argue in the book that they all were based on something fundamental, something that I call an epistemology, or a way of knowing about the world. And that was a widely shared understanding that a statement of fact about matters of government could not stand apart from its referentiality to a physical document that either actually existed or that people might plausibly be led to believe existed. That administrative truth and government truth, official truth in this world, was incumbent upon saying that one's official truth was grounded in some type of document that might exist somewhere in the world. And the proliferation of these practices reflected that these protocols and techniques of document use collectively constituted a powerful style of political reasoning, what I call political reasoning in the book. That is to say, a way of making a claim in which the presentation of a claim's evidentiary basis was considered as integral to how it was persuasive as the claim itself. So not just we should govern like this, but we should govern like this because the documents, the archives say that we should. Now, one of my big themes in the book is how war and conquest continuously drove administrators to take this way of archival reasoning and try to expand it and try to apply it to ruling an empire that increasingly was one that contemplated the membership of non-British, non-English speaking subjects within its political compass. And this was a particularly important question in South Asia after 1765, when the British East India Company received the rights to collect revenue in the territory of Bengal from the Mughal emperor, an event dramatized in this painting of this event that was made by an American, by the Pennsylvania-born artist Benjamin West around 1818. And after 1765, I argue in the book, administrators increasingly sought to posit the existence of non-English and non-Latin language archives created out of the materials of so-called conquered peoples, which they then analogized as equivalent to the metropolitan archives in their capacity to produce authoritative political knowledge. They began to learn new languages, especially South Asian languages, in order to translate documents in this archive, the published compilations of texts made out of of documents in this archive, in order to kind of constitute their own administrative archive in order to govern over difference, in order to govern over cultural difference. Now, this archive regime, this archival mode of reasoning, did not last forever. And by the early 19th century, the book argues in its concluding chapter, the terms of political discourse had increasingly come to change in the British Empire in a manner that began to push the archive out of the field of political contestation and the field of political reasoning. New forms of knowledge increasingly ascended in the estimation of administrators who increasingly believed that they were better suited, these new forms of knowledge were better suited to solving problems of government. And the consequence of this was that archives began to transform out of being tools of rule to something that is perhaps more familiar to us today, into sites where people went to do history, to make history, to research history. And central to this transformation, I show in the book, was a rise of a set of entwined ideas about the nature of government and information. Ideas that are increasingly, that are very much embedded in our own political expectations about government and information, but which only came to prominence at the end of the 18th century. First, a concept of officials or bureaucrats as accountable not only to sovereigns, but also to a public. And second, the idea that this public needed access to information about government in order to render officials accountable, that the public needed to know what government was doing if it was now expected to hold the government accountable. And as the sixth and final chapter of the book shows, the archive would play a very different role in the shifting constellation of power, one that signaled the recession, both temporally and ideologically, of an early modern concept of power and information rooted in the privilege of the state. And this development was seen, I show, in the diminishing administrative and political power of archivists, a broadening of access to archives, to the public, and an ideology of political knowledge that disconnected the meaning of policy from the materiality of information. This did not, I emphasize, end practices of governmental secrecy, far from it, but it allowed governments to keep secrets while also opening up knowledge of their past to democratic publics. And so in some ways, to maintain something of the older system of state secrecy, while at the same time gesturing by opening up knowledge of their past to growing democratic expectations about what citizens had a right to know about what their leaders were doing. What remained, even with the shift away from the archival mode of administration, however, was the underlying problem that imperial rulers had used to solve: how to govern in relation to cultural difference. Modern states continue to grapple with how to bind to different people together through projecting norms whose widespread harmony, or whose widespread adoption, they hope, will help fulfill some vision of what civic harmony looks like. And modern companies also aspire to forge common preferences and desires out of which they can generate profits. Data remains fundamental to both. And increasingly, of course, this data does not take the form of parchment and paper. But the practices of collecting, using, and storing data remain crucial to these aspirations because they allow states and companies to measure how close they are to fulfilling their goals. According to what rules should this information be gathered? How should it be used? Who should have access to it? These questions continue to preoccupy our world, much as they did the strange and remote world of the early modern British Empire that I explore in the Archive of Empire. The past is at once more distant and more proximate than we may think. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the questions and the discussion.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. And I know all of us who think often about those trunks and the papers of general gauge and what they mean are thrilled with your work. So thank you. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section, and I am just going to share a couple of housekeeping slides, and then we'll get on to the questions. All righty, next month. So the Bookworm happens every third Friday. So if you've just signed up, you'll receive an email next month reminding you about the Bookworm, and you can once again choose to participate live, or everyone will also receive the any of the notes that were pasted in the chat will go out in an email along with the link to the recording later this afternoon. And next month, we have Stephen Peach talking about Rivers of Power, Creek Political Culture in the Native South, 1750 to 1815. So I hope you join us for that. And then at the Clements Library, our exhibit, An Ungentle Art, Cat Elephant and the American Tradition of Political Satire, continues through December 13th. So you can come visit that exhibit in person And it is also available online to take a look. Once again, thank you very much to today's anonymous donor who generously sponsored the Bookworm. We appreciate everyone who continues to participate in this program in any form, whether watching it live or the recording. And we appreciate all of your questions and excitement about these topics. And if you do have any interest in sponsoring a future episode, you can contact me, or if you have any questions or comments, you can also respond to the email that you receive from me. All righty, so thank you for all of that, and I'll stop sharing, and we can take a look and see what kinds of questions we have. All right. Oh, this is an interesting one. Tom is asking a little bit more about those different branches and geographies of the same government and whether they're in competition with each other over the archival data.
Absolutely. So in the early modern period, these different branches of government are absolutely in competition, and particularly important for my exploration is the competition and contestation between the British state and its archives and those of the East India Company. The East India Company in the 17th and 18th centuries does a lot of the governance of British Asia, and it does so in this very complicated way where it is at once kind of a commercial entity that is engaged in trade with non-Europeans, not just indeed in India, but also in China, and has a monopoly in doing so, but is also granted that monopoly by the British monarchy, and so is a creature of the crown, is a creature of the state, and that leads it into a very type of complicated situation where it is under the sovereignty of the same British monarchy that is the ruler of the empire in the Atlantic world, but also a corporation that is asserting that it has some types of proprietary control over its own data and information. And so my book is filled with stories of the contestation between the company and the government, and then increasingly by the end of the 18th century, Parliament, which comes into being as this other party that is asserting by the end of the 17th century power to govern the empire, power to make legislation over the empire, over who gets to control what records. And so a lot of this history is about how different competing conceptions of power are tied to arguments and assertions of control over information, often the same information, and things get very heated and very messy, as I show in the book.
Thank you. That's great. And so this is a good question from Leanne. If archives were so important to the British Empire, how did we come to have all of these records in the USA? And why wouldn't they have taken them back to England?
This is a wonderful question, and it actually points to one of the most interesting things that I look at. That is interesting to me that I also ended up writing about in the book. So despite the fact that states and corporations in this period were asserting their total control over their own information ecosystems, their total monopoly over the documents that were being created in their names, one of the most fascinating phenomena is the fact that the very people who were making those arguments, the officials who were making those arguments that all of these records are the records of the state, were at the very same time as they were doing that, taking documents out of official archives, sometimes copying them, sometimes just taking them, and compiling them in their own personal archives, in their own personal repositories of records. And one of the reasons they were doing this is because um, they really increasingly in this world did not see the state or government as separate from themselves. They did not have, in some ways, the modern idea of the bureaucrat who is sort of just a servant of the institution and separates their own personality from the execution of what they are being told to do. In this world, the official and the personal were deeply, deeply intermeshed, and that's actually one of the reasons why um, so many officials, why you can find in so many personal papers uh, uh, official government records that you would think should just be in the state archives. And I'll just bring up the fact that at the Clements Library, one of the people who does this to an amazing degree is an administrator named William Knox, some of whose papers are at the Clements Library. And what Knox does, in part during the American Revolution, when he is kind of like the PR guy for the monarchy, kind of in the administration, sort of selling trying to sell the continuation of the empire to Parliament and to the Americans, and obviously not quite successfully to the Americans. Um, he is constantly just copying and sometimes just taking documents out of the archives of the state, and a lot of them end up in his personal collection. And so if you go and you look at his papers at the Clements, you'll find copies of things that technically were secret, right? Technically should not have been there. And so, some of these debates that we now are having, even now today, about what is a presidential paper, what is a government paper, where are those things separate? These were very live issues and questions in the early modern period.
Thank you. So James Davis is asking about the role that maps played in the empire. Was there tension between the desire to keep some maps secret and the desire on the part of merchants to have the latest, most accurate maps? So yeah.
Absolutely. There was a great deal of contestation over the control of maps, something that also interacted with the growing kind of political discourse and debate about the empire and the interest from scholars and writers in how the expansion of the empire was changing and challenging geographic ideas that had long been kind of pertinent in European intellectual and political discourse. I mean, this is a period in which um, Europeans they don't know a lot about what the geography of what is today the United States, North America really looks like beyond the Appalachians. They're learning a lot about that in this period. And at the same time, this is also a period in which by the end of the 18th century, Europeans are kind of for the first time really learning about the Pacific, for example. And the the question of how mapping intersects with this process of collection of information, and how also one can publish a map that is useful to a lot of different people, especially sailors to ship captains, while also trying to keep parts of the geographic knowledge you're grappling with secret, is a big challenge in this period. It's one that governments and companies are constantly confronting as they try to maintain control of commerce, but also want to facilitate their exploitation of it by their servants.
Thank you. So Jamal has a question, and he works on sort of the economics of the early British Empire. And so he's asking a bit more about um, the sort of this archival shift that you talk about, and what you argue the shifts in the archive meant for the British and non-British subjects of the empire. Is there
Yeah.
any? Yeah, so
So, one of the points that Jamal makes in this excellent question is that for a long time, historians of the British Empire thought that the British Empire changed in the middle of the 18th century, and especially as a result of the American Revolution. And that what had happened was that before the American Revolution, the British Empire had been mainly interested in facilitating trade and protecting its commercial system of internal trade between kind of its colonies and its mother homeland in Britain itself. And then that after the American Revolution, the British Empire's priorities changed, where they were increasingly interested not so much in trade, but in territorial conquest and the conquest of new of different places and directly administering territories. And Bengal, as well as Quebec, is taken often as a sign of this shift in as a shift in this nature of imperial priorities. I both agree and disagree with that framing, and just to make a very long, complicated academic debate short, increasingly historians these days don't quite believe that that shift really occurred, that actually trade and conquest were embedded in the so-called First British Empire of the 17th and early 18th centuries. But what I do argue in the book is that one of the things that is fascinating to me is that as the British Empire does expand after the 7 Years' War, as it comes to have, this expanded presence in North America, in the Caribbean, in South Asia, one of the things that it does to try to make sense of how to govern over non-British people. So, South Asians in Bengal, the French in Canada, there are lots of French settlers in Quebec. What it does is it tries to create archives out of the purported administrative past of these peoples, and it sort of tries to get documents from different people and tries to sort of come up with these systems of governing both the French in Canada and then Indians in Bengal, based on their so-called purported ancient constitution. So rather than imposing British law on these places, they say what they're doing is they are administering the ancient laws of the people who they have conquered based on reading, collecting, and compiling the documents or the archives of these people. And so it's a fascinating moment where this sort of archival mode of reasoning is being expanded to try to encompass this problem of governing in relation to difference. And so it's an archival way of thinking about how to make rules for people who don't speak your language, don't worship your God, and who have had up until that point a very different, who've been living under a very different type of ruler. And so that's a very fascinating practice to me, and it's something that I read about a great deal in the book. Oh, Angela, I think you might be muted.
Thank you. Uh, Deborah is asking about the move from parchment to paper, and do you think these kinds of shifts in technology affected the information that was recorded?
So that's what a great question. I mean, I think so, and in part it's a result that of the fact that paper was much easier to produce than parchment, because you don't have to rely on the presence of a dead animal, which is not to be too grotesque so early in the morning, but I mean that's what we're talking about, right? With parchment, and we're talking about animal skin, and I do think that shift expanded the possibility of recording more and more information. And I'd also add that it also expanded the possibility of recording information in areas of the world where parchment was essentially inconceivable as a substrate of government, especially in South Asia, where parchment would have been made was inconceivable because people regarded the animals that parchment was being made out of as divine. And one of the things that I think is interesting to think about with this subject is how in the early modern period, I mean, parchment and paper aren't universal substrates. They're European substrates, and we think of paper as a kind of universal, but it's something that is actually entering into these other parts of the world through empire, through imperial conquest, it interacts in all of these different contexts with other traditions of recording information, from bark codices that are used in the Americas by the first peoples of the Americas, to palm leaf manuscripts that are used in South Asia, the tradition of writing on palm leaves and recording information. And so, even though we today kind of think of our technologies, and to some extent, because of global capitalism, they do become, or seem to become, much more universal. This is a world in which, parchment and paper are very particular types of substrates that are interacting with a lot of other ones. And their dominance is really a result, not per se of that they are necessarily better than these other substrates, but because of politics, because of empire, because of war, because of conquest.
That's really interesting. And then Paul sort of takes a different take on the materiality. And he's wondering if, the importance of the collection and preservation of information change along with the changes in durability of the media. So, kind of going back to this idea of those, some of those objects are more permanent than others.
Absolutely. And preservation is a huge challenge in this world. I mean, we're talking about a world, right, in which there isn't any air conditioning, and people are having to hold a lot of these papers in damp, dank, dusty rooms. And it's amazing to think about how much survives because of how much didn't survive. I mean, the letters of government of the 18th century, the correspondence of government, is full of people talking about how they either have lost documents, that documents are falling apart because they got ripped up, or they were on a ship and the ship sunk, that there was a fire in the governor's office, and so our correspondence for the last year, half of it's gotten burned up. This is a world in which preservation is a very, very difficult thing, and in which people are trying to constantly find ways to fight the key enemies of fire, water, heat, and insects, and having a lot of trouble trying to do that. And sometimes, if you look at old documents, I mean, you'll see the evidence of fire, the burnt nature of things at the edge. You'll see holes where bugs have eaten through the manuscripts. I mean, these are really, really live problems. And actually, we talk about, sometimes we talk about these things like the manuscript. The manuscript itself, I mean, the idea of taking single sheets of paper, binding them together in a codex-like thing, is a preservation technology in this period. It's a way that people are trying to preserve what are otherwise single discrete sheets of paper. And today we kind of we go to a special collection, and so we're handed this stuff and we start thumbing through it for what exactly we want. But in this period, I mean, the manuscript is actually like the hard drive, right? Like the external hard drive, like the way that you try to preserve all of this stuff. Same with print. I mean, putting things into print is a way of trying to preserve them in some ways, and oftentimes, and trying to make sure that, well, if they're printed, if the original gets lost, we still have the backup copy. Um, Angela, I think you might mean,
Oh, I apologize.
no, no.
Speaking of the backup copies, Tom is wondering if the letters and documents were widely copied to duplicate and then, multiply the archival information.
Very much so. So, in this period, with no copy machines, without reprographic technology, the copy machines are secretaries, who are working alongside, people like General Gage, the kind of the big, the military officers, the generals, the political decision makers, who often do not leave much of a trace of their own lives or thinking in the archives, but who are there and who do the work of copying documents, sometimes in duplicate, sometimes in triplicate, sometimes in quadruplicate, to try to make sure that even if something gets lost, it will remain. And oftentimes, what political officials will do is that they will keep books where they after they write a letter, they'll have their secretary write a copy of that letter in a book, in kind of like a backup a backup hard drive in case the letter gets lost and they need to try to remember what they sent. And so these the in some ways, right, the past really is quite different, but in a lot of ways, they're also grappling with some of the same questions that we do today. How do you preserve information? Today we got, the cloud, but in that case, right, they didn't, and so they were trying to find ways to get around that problem.
Thank you. Tom is also wondering about the status of the British Indian archives today.
It's a fascinating question. So, the archives of the British state, which are now held at the National Archives, which is in Kew Garden in West London, used to be first in this period the office that they were nominally supposed to be held at, which they weren't often, but in theory they were supposed to, was called the State Paper Office. That is to say, it was the office of the papers of the state, and you can see in that phrase, State Papers Office, that the documents were regarded right as the papers of the state, as the papers of the sovereign. In the mid 19th century, from about the 1830s onward, that office came to be renamed in a very telling way. It began to be referred to and then was officially renamed as the Public Record Office, right? As the same papers that once were the proprietary possession of the state eventually came to be referred to and stored. They didn't change the papers, but they started calling them public records, right? As new expectations and demands about the public accessibility of government documents were arising. And for a while, they were held in central London, and then they eventually were transformed into, again, here another very telling shift in terminology, the National Archives, which are now in West London in Kew Gardens. And so we can even see in just how the name of the archive was changing that that there was that how expectations among the public about what archives were supposed to be accessible to them kind of reflected that. Very quickly, the archives of the East India Company were never really united with the with those of the state. They remained sort of in the possession of the corporation for a very long time, until its dissolution with the end of company rule in the middle of the 19th century. And then they transferred to the property of the crown once the crown took over government of British India. And they eventually came to be, through a long and circuitous process, initially housed in kind of on their own, and now they're housed at the British Library in central London on the third floor in what used to be called the India Office Records, but now is called Asian and African Studies. And so there's a very interesting kind of post kind of post 19th century story about how exactly these archives came to be regarded as, as part of the history, part of a history that the public should have access to and that historians should have access to. A very different set of ideas about information from this early modern world, in which, that idea about the public accessibility would have sounded just kind of completely dangerous to these administrators who were like, well, no, if we let people access it, that means we're losing our own power, right? We're losing our own proprietary possession of knowledge, right?
Interesting. Thank you. So Bruce is thinking then about whether or not the British record keeping actually gave them a strategic advantage over the other empire building nations, and or were they doing just as good a job keeping records?
So it's a fascinating question, and indeed, this is a world. I mean, I focus on the British side of things, but this is a world in which across Western Europe, in states are doing something very similar, at least at one level, to the British, which is that they are also collecting documents in large state archives, and they are doing the same kind of work of trying to make policy or justify policy based on archival evidence. They're making the same kind of claims about how uh, sovereignty and political power is tied to the control and use of information. And so the French and the Spanish and the Dutch are no less interested in building up their own archives, which they do. Um, uh, so the Spanish, French, Dutch also did rely heavily on records to support their expansion. That of course raises some interesting questions, including the question of what made the British case kind of interesting or distinctive, despite the common set of ideas about how political power and the control of information were to be tied, which were shared across European polities. One of the things that I suggest in the book is that um, in the British Empire, there was a heightened problem because of its kind of global reach and global scope, and because of the way that it combined a number of different forms of sovereignty under its compass, especially the corporate sovereignty of institutions like the East India Company, as well as other imperial corporations who I write about a bit in the book, like the Royal African Company, as well as the power of the crown. Um, it was one in which there was a constant kind of competition between not just the empire and its European enemies, but also a kind of a competition within the empire between these different sets of power that were all kind of had overlapping abilities to govern in these different places, and all were kind of competing to control information with each other about these things. And so I think that contestation makes the kind of the British case a particular one in early modern Europe, whereas in Spain and France there are far stronger monopolies on this by their respective monarchies. That those monarchies have much stronger monopolies on imperial information than the British monarchy does. And I mean, Bruce also asks a kind of another about the strategic advantage. I think it's very hard to say. I mean, I think that there's always that risk of a kind of better knowledge, better information makes better or more effective governance. And I think actually that my book suggests that is too simple an equation, because in some ways better information or more information also creates certain problems. First, it creates problems of how you store all of this stuff, a very practical problem. But also, one of the things that I write about a great deal is that um, the meaning of information and even what kind of information, despite its proliferation, is constantly contested by people who are supposedly on the same team, who are supposedly all interested in the success of the British Empire, but who have very different ideas about what that is going to be. And more information doesn't actually help them resolve those problems. It just exacerbates and sort of intensifies um, sort of the rhetorical violence, if you will, of political debate. It makes people um, more and more angry at each other and more kind of combative. And I write about how those kind of that combativeness, it certainly is there and begins in the 17th century, but then it really ramps up by the end of the 18th century, especially as imperial officials, particularly those of the East India Company, begin to be put on trial for the company's mismanagement um, of revenue collection and kind of the disaster of corruption and corrupt government in Bengal. And at that point in the 1780s and 1790s, the contestation gets especially heated, which makes makes it really interesting in the context of the trials of East India Company officials like Warren Hastings. And I read a great deal about how information plays out in those debates.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you everybody for such great questions. That's one of the things I know I always appreciate is all of that information. It's so great. So thank you so much, Asheesh. This has been wonderful.
Thank you so much, Angela, and thank you so much to everybody for coming. I really appreciate you taking the time out to come, and thanks so much to Angela and to Helen and to Paul and to everyone at the Clements for all the work that you do every day and all the work that you do to make these events happen. I just wanted to say that at this time, I think when the humanities and having conversations about them and putting those conversations to the public are more important than ever. And it's also so important that we have institutions like the Clements that are there to help us preserve the past and make it accessible to the public. And so, thanks to all you all for coming out and for supporting the library and all the great work that that the folks there do.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody. Have a fantastic weekend. Bye.